Hi everyone, this time we are talking about working class crime following our lecture on white collar crime. So I'll do first a general introduction, then we will talk about property crime and its specific illegalities, and then organized crime. So working class crime is the stuff that we're most likely to think of as actually being crime. Um, and it often comes from a place of underprivileged deviance. This being defined as deviance among relatively poor and powerless people. This form of deviance is often less profitable and more disreputable. And when we talk about that, we're saying less profitable, more disreputable than white collar crime. This form of crime is especially applicable to Merton's strain theory, which we discussed earlier in the course. Specifically, Merton's strain theory as pertains to the innovator typology, right? So people who commit underprivileged deviance often commit robbery, auto theft, burglary, shoplifting, take part in organized crime. These are crimes that people commit to make money, to take part in that innovator typology of Merton's. Now let's discuss property crime quickly. One type of property crime is robbery, which is unlawfully taking a victim's property. This includes use or threat of violence, but it can also not include that. Targets are chosen according to the desire for money. So targets are chosen because they have it, right? That's how people choose who to rob. The risk of arrest. So if someone with a whole lot of money is likely to cause you to be arrested, right? Say they're a high-profile individual, you might not necessarily rob them. However, if they don't have much money but you know you're not going to get arrested, then you might choose to rob that person. Additionally, difficulty in planning also helps the robber decide who to rob. Most typically, when we observe this kind of behavior, it's the easy targets, it's the low-risk targets, and it's the targets with at least a little bit of money. That's how robbers, muggers, these type of people decide who they're going to prey on. In the United States, it usually takes the form of mugging. So mugging being threatening to hurt someone unless you give them their money. In Europe, a major cultural difference is that Europeans, when they steal things from each other, they tend to pick pockets. Unarmed robbery has an increased chance of violence as opposed to armed robbery. So what does that mean? That means if someone threatens to beat you up unless you give them your money, then that person is more likely to fight back. But if you hold a gun up to someone and threaten to shoot them, unless you give them their money, there is actually less chance that the robber is going to be harmed, because when you see a gun, you usually just give up. However, the risk of death when the armed robber actually fights back is dramatically higher, because a gun is actually taken in and the person feels like they've actually been threatened with their life, as opposed to just being threatened, being beaten up a little bit. There are some patterns that go along with robbery. Robbery is more frequent in big cities, largely due to anonymity. Flowing into the next one. Robbery is more common among strangers. If you don't know someone, you're less likely to rob them. And robbery is more frequent in cold winter months. Most of that is probably tied with Christmas being in the cold winter months and that being a peak time for robbery. Other types of crime are actually a lot more common in the summertime, but robbery specifically is more common in cold months. Robbery more frequently occurs indoors, which is really interesting. Now, that statistic doesn't include indoor garages. Probably some of it, so that might boost that statistic up. But we're talking about malls. We're talking about large apartment complexes that are inside. Most most robberies, most robbers are armed, right? So when you do decide to rob someone, usually you would take a gun with you. Most robbers who get arrested are relatively young. This is one of those crimes that stupid young people do, right? They do it because they don't recognize the full ramifications of their action. And robbery is more interracial than other crimes. Because of laws of proximity, we tend to commit crimes against people of similar races than ourselves because these are the people we live among, right? We tend to do our crimes actually in our communities. However, with robberies, there is a greater tendency for the robber to go out of their community to do their crime, and a lot of that is because people see greater chances for profit outside of their own community in this regard. Robbers and muggers can be classified as two types. They may be either amateur or professional. We'll check out that a little bit on the following slide. An amateur robber will rob for small amounts of money. So the $50, the $20 you might have in your pocket. And they do that with less planning. They might just pick someone. There's actually a dramatically greater chance of arrest with amateur robbery. Additionally, amateur robbers tend to be opportunists, so they tend to see people, okay, this person's particularly vulnerable and there are no cops anywhere around me, I'm going to do it. They also tend to be addicts and alcoholics, again, because those conditions put the robber in a more prone situation and they're more desperate to get the substance that they need, or they might be slightly impaired. That is another reason why these types of people tend to be amateur robbers. Professional robbers tend to carefully plan out their robberies, and they are less likely to get caught. They're less likely to do something like a mugging. They might be more likely to do something like breaking in a home, and less likely probably to do something like a home invasion. They do rob in teams, and they target individuals with large amounts of money. And again, this is more of a heist type situation. Now, why do people do these things? The most popular theory behind robbery is what's known as relative deprivation theory. This states that robberies indicate other societal problems. So, the fact that people don't have money and other people do have money and concentrated resources, those people that live in areas with concentrated resources might be more likely to be robbed because people outside of that area know that the people that live in this suburb have a lot of money. It also indicates unequal access to ownership in a society with great social inequality where the poor have very little and the rich have a lot. Then according to this theory, we would expect to see increased robbery rates and increased opportunities to steal. If there is less security going on in a situation, it's more likely to happen. So here is where robbery is most likely to happen. This is your 2008 numbers. It's about a decade old, but it's about pretty much the same. A commercial house, according to this definition, would be something like a mall, or something like a mall plaza, something along those lines. Maybe in even the parking lot at Best Buy or something like that. 37% of robberies happen in that place. 36% of robberies take place in residences, so people's homes or in apartment buildings. I would suspect that the majority of those numbers are when people are not actually home, but some of those would be home invasions. 15% of robberies take place at convenience stores. Gas stations are about 7% of robberies, and banks, that we actually think of a lot of bank robberies happen. Actually, only about 5% of robberies occur at banks. Auto theft is another type of property crime. It's a more specific type of property crime. There has been societally a recent increase in auto theft. This is seen as being the most significant property crime, often because cars are expensive and it provides a quick profit. So if you break into someone's house, you're in all likelihood not going to get away with something as valuable as a car is. So that's that thinking there. And it provides very quick profit. So if you break into a house, you have to sell those things that you buy to somebody one thing at a time. The car you could just sell to somebody right away, or you have a car, one or the other. Carjacking is another type of auto theft. Usually when we talk about auto theft, we're talking about breaking into a car and stealing it. Carjacking is taking the car when somebody is in it, and that can be violent. So it would be going up to somebody's door when they are at a stoplight and forcing them out of the car and taking it. About 50% of carjackings are successful. And this is one of those crimes that unless you actually have a child in the car, if there's no one else in the car with you, it probably is in your best interest to just let the person have the car. Burglary in opposition to robbery is characteristically rational and well planned. So I take back a little bit of what I said the other minute. When we talk about robbery, we are talking about, sorry about my bird. When we talk about robbery, we're talking about a one-on-one, one person taking money from another person. So breaking into somebody's house, that's robbery if they are there. Burglary, on the other hand, is going in when the home is empty. And as I said, home invasions are relatively rare in terms of actually burglary. So here we see crimes in 1990 and 2009. We see that auto theft has actually gone down pretty dramatically over that decade. We see that robbery has gone down, and as has burglary. So from 1990 to 2009, the crime rate actually went down rather dramatically. And a lot of that is because surveillance technology has increased a lot, and our knowledge of how these crimes are committed have increased. So therefore, we're able to prevent those crimes from actually happening. Shoplifting is another type of property crime. This is stealing products from a store, and it costs businesses somewhere in the neighborhood of $31 billion a year. It's sometimes thought of as being a victimless crime, but the reality of the matter is that it does drive up prices for all consumers, so those would be the victims. The couple extra dollars you have to pay for an item is because other items have been stolen. The motivation for shoplifting is typically of an economic need, even though there are also social psychological reasons. So some people who shoplift do it because they need a thing. Other people shoplift because it's a cheap thrill, especially for teenagers. And it is a cheap thrill that is highly accessible to the general public. That's how some people get addicted to shoplifting. So only a small percentage of shoplifters are actually professional thieves. These people are often referred to as boosters. And the other people who actually shoplift are predominantly juvenile offenders, so predominantly teenagers. These are typically small items stolen for personal use, like razors, toothbrushes, batteries, socks, maybe. And actually, when you look at the statistics, men shoplift more often than women. It's a common misperception that women shoplift more than men, but often it's men actually doing that crime. Let's briefly go over organized crime. So the media often glamorizes organized crime, um, and in a way, because it's an interesting story, right? Most organized crime groups form along racial lines, and that's often because of being discriminated against group. If you're a member of a discriminated against group, you are then therefore relatively deprived, like we talked about a little bit earlier. Well, if a big group of people is deprived by society, discriminated against by society, eventually some of those people may decide to rise up and lash out against society. The first organized crime groups in the United States were actually Jewish people in the 1800s. They called their groups the Unterstück. That's based on Yiddish words for it roughly translates to this bad thing we do. Um, the mafia, similarly, was the second round of organized crime in the United States, and all of these groups still exist in the United States, by the way. They just tend to go in cycles, right? So after the Unterstück went through, then the mafia came. The mafia dominated things, even though the Unterstück still kind of existed. And then after the Italians kind of faded away a little bit in the mid 20th century, then the Russians took a lot of that power. Obviously, this could vary from area to area. The Jews and Russians specifically did most of their organized crime in the New York area. Russians also had a lot of their organized crime happening in New York and other places in the United States. Bratva is actually a Russian for the Brotherhood. Chinese triads and Yakuza, Japanese Yakuza, are actually rising in power in the modern day. The triads and Yakuza tend to be a little bit more prominent on the West Coast, while the other groups tend to be on the East Coast. So what do organized criminals do? Well, they basically do a lot of the things that individual criminals do it, but they do it on a grander scale, right? So they do illegal gambling, they do loan sharking. So loan sharking is giving somebody a loan and then demanding a lot more money back later. They distribute narcotics. In the modern era, they do a lot of credit card theft. They do extortion. So they say, okay, you pay us for protection so that nothing happens to your store. And then the implication is, well, if you don't pay us for protection, we're going to burn down your store. And they also corrupt public officials. They make them do the things that they want them to do. Okay, and those are the kinds of crimes that those that don't do white-collar crimes go over. Obviously, we didn't really talk about murder. We didn't really talk about rape here because we talk about those in other sections. Similarly, those types of crimes do tend to be more evenly distributed across class lines, while the crimes we talked about in this lecture tend to occur more in the working and middle classes, and then the white-collar crime lecture, those are crimes that occur more in the upper classes. Okay, if you have any questions about this stuff, please let me know, and I will talk to you later.